Welcome to the 102nd episode of the Henry George A. Devotional. We continue in Book 10, Chapter 1. Book 10 is the Law of Human Progress. Chapter 1, the current theory of human progress, its insufficiency. Um, yeah, I think last time George basically said that the idea that each successive generation has somehow hereditarily improved doesn't account for a lot of civilizations that reach a certain point and then just stagnate. And the other explanation of innate capacity also doesn't seem to, what's the word, hold water? Is that a, yeah, the reason it doesn't hold water. Also because we look at all these other far away, older civilizations that arose and then crumbled, and it sure seems like any old race, quote unquote race, can achieve progress. I'm sure if you, I don't know. It's sort of, there's some sort of like symmetry seeking in me that wishes I knew of some like ancient high level African civilization. But I guess since we all came from Africa, you could sort of, I don't know. Um, yeah, do we know, has there ever been a highly developed African ancient. Oh, well, Egypt. That's so funny. I mean, I think of Egypt as like the Middle East. The kingdom of Aksum. So, you say Egypt, you have then China, you have Inca, Mayan, and then Germanic or whatever, and Rome. I don't know, man. Not a history major. Alright. George writes, one of the best popular expounders of the development philosophy, Walter Baggio. Should we find out how to actually say this guy's name? We've read it before.
Budget.
Badgett. Alright, fine. Sometimes those are not the common pronunciation, but anyway. Walter Bagehot, Physics and Politics, admits the force of this objection. One of the best popular and endeavors in this way to explain it. Alright, I'm not exactly sure. Well, let's just hear his explanation. That the first thing necessary to civilize man is to tame him, to induce him to live in association with his fellows, in subordination to law, and hence a body or cake of laws and customs grows up. Being intensified and extended by natural selection, the tribe or nation thus bound together having an advantage over those who are not. That this cake of custom and law finally becomes too thick and hard to permit further progress, which can go on only as circumstances occur which introduce discussion and thus permit the freedom and mobility necessary to improvement. This explanation, which Mr. Bagehot offers, as he says, with some misgivings. Oh, that's kind of interesting. This guy actually said he's not sure about it. This explanation is, I think, at the expense of the general theory, but it is not worthwhile speaking of that, for it manifestly does not explain the facts. Alright, this guy proposes, you have to tame wild man, and induce him to live in association with others, and that, I guess, is done by offering this advantage. The advantage of working together, or under a body of laws, is the reason that they work together. Yeah. And then this idea that this cake gets baked and is hard, uh, limits the association. The hardening tendency of which Mr. Bagehot speaks would show itself at a very early period of development, and his illustrations of it are nearly all drawn from savage or semi-savage life. Whereas these arrested civilizations had gone a long distance before they stopped. There must have been a time when they were very far advanced as compared with the savage state, and were yet plastic, free and advancing, and yet were plastic, free and okay. There must have been a time when they were very far advanced as compared with the savage state, and were yet plastic, free and advancing. Okay, so these customs hadn't calcified, is the moment we're thinking about. These arrested civilizations stopped at a point which was hardly in anything inferior and in many respects superior to European civilization of, say, the 16th, or at any rate the 15th century. So, okay, a lot of these ancient civilizations got up to 15th or 16th century European civilization. Up to that point, then, there must have been discussion, the hailing of what was new, and mental activity of all sorts. They had architects who carried the art of building, necessarily by a series of innovations or improvements up to a very high point. Shipbuilders who in the same way, by innovation after innovation, finally produced as good a vessel as the warships of Henry VIII. Inventors who stopped only on the verge of our most important improvements, and from some of whom we can yet learn. Engineers who constructed great irrigation works and navigable canals. Rival schools of philosophy and conflicting ideas of religion. One great religion in many respects, resembling Christianity, rose in India, displaced the old religion, passed into China, sweeping over that country, and was displaced again in its old seats, just as Christianity was displaced in its first seats. There was life, and active life, and the innovation that begets improvement, long after men had learned to live together. And moreover, both India and China have received the infusion of new life in conquering races, with different customs and modes of thought. Yeah, I remember when I read this the first time, it was you're like, duh. There was a time when Egypt, for instance, I think he likes to really talk a lot about Egypt. Yep, he's about to talk about Egypt. Uh, didn't have hieroglyphs and really cool headdresses, and didn't know how to mummify their pharaohs, and didn't know how to build pyramids, and they had to progress. It's sort of because you see the peak of these civilizations gets, I don't know, fossilized in our museums, that I have this tendency to think of them being everlastingly at this level of development, and yet that cannot be so. And now I'm also curious about somebody tell me, what were these religions that resembled Christianity that rose in India? I mean, Hinduism, I guess, and then it was displaced in, is it, like, Christianity was displaced in its first seats, I guess because they went back to Judaism in Israel, whereas, I don't know, Greek and Italy sure stayed pretty Christian. Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians. Anyway, this point that there was a lot of improvement after men had learned to live together, that initial taming of the savage state, that there was still much progress after they got tamed. All right. George writes, the most fixed and petrified of all civilizations of which we know anything was that of Egypt. Yeah, this is what I half remember. Where even art finally assumed a conventional and inflexible form, but we know that behind this must have been a time of life and vigor, a freshly developing and expanding civilization such as ours is now, or the arts and sciences could never have been carried to such a pitch. And recent excavations have brought to light from beneath what we before knew of Egypt and earlier Egypt still, in statues and carvings, which, instead of a hard and formal type, beam with life and expression, which show art struggling, ardent, natural, and free, the sure indication of an active and expanding life. So it must have been once with all now unprogressive civilizations. The funny thing is, 1930s Egyptology. I'm pretty sure. I don't know. Latest discovery of Aristotle scroll. Researchers have just read a new scroll. Oh yeah, I remember when this was. Dang. Democracy creative. What I'm looking for is I don't think it's here. Historical roots. Part 2, historical roots. Let's see. Egypt is not in this one. Aristotle. That's the only. Alright, I don't know. We'll keep going. But basically, I thought I read that in the early 20th century, like maybe not the 1920s or 30s, we learned a lot more about Egypt, including also we learned more about ancient Athens. We found some evidence of their using sortition. So in George's time, he would not have known some of these things, which is interesting to me. And we do continue to find more and more ancient history, which is also interesting to me. All right, we will continue here. Let's see, will we try to finish this? Oof. Maybe. George writes, but it is not merely these arrested civilizations that the current theory of development fails to account for. It is not merely that men have gone so far on the path of progress and then stopped. It is that men have gone far on the path of progress and then gone back. It is not merely an isolated case that thus confronts the theory. It is the universal rule. Yeah, and yet the net progress of humans is increasing. We are more progressed now than we ever have been. And you might argue that we are continually, each civilization is a little more just than the previous one, often. And so, I don't know, some forms of justice might have been lost, but I don't know. Every civilization that the world has yet seen has had its period of vigorous growth, of arrest and stagnation, its decline and fall. Of all the civilizations that have arisen and flourished, there remain today but those that have been arrested, and our own, which is not yet as old as were the pyramids when Abraham looked upon them, while behind the pyramids were 20 centuries of recorded history. When were the pyramids built? Yeah, man. Isn't that, we have to remember this. 4,000-ish years ago, 4,000 years ago, they built the pyramids. That our own civilization has a broader base is of a more advanced type, moves quicker and soars higher than any preceding civilization is undoubtedly true. But in these respects it is hardly more in advance of the Greco-Roman civilization than it was in advance of Asiatic civilization. And if it were, that would prove nothing as to its permanence and future advance, unless it be shown that it is superior in those things which caused the ultimate failure of its predecessors. The current theory does not assume this. Yeah, the current theory only says that, we have this cake of customs and rules that become inflexible. Um, the current theory doesn't really say anything about whether this current form is superior. In truth, nothing could be further from explaining the facts of universal history than this theory that civilization is the result of a course of natural selection which operates to improve and elevate the powers of man. That civilization has arisen at different times in different places and has progressed at different rates is not inconsistent with this theory, for that might result from the unequal balancing of impelling and resisting forces. But that progress everywhere commencing, for even among the lowest tribes it is held that there has been some progress, has nowhere been continuous, but has everywhere been brought to a stand or retrogression, is absolutely inconsistent. For if progress operated to fix an improvement in man's nature, and thus to produce further progress, though there might be occasional interruption, yet the general rule would be that progress would be continuous, that advance would lead to advance, and civilization develop into higher civilization. Not merely the general rule, but the universal rule is the reverse of this. The earth is the tomb of the dead empires, no less than of dead men. Instead of progress fitting men for greater progress, every civilization that was in its own time as vigorous and advancing as ours is now, has of itself come to a stop. Over and over again art has declined, learning sunk, power waned, population become sparse, until the people who had built great temples and mighty cities, turned rivers and pierced mountains, cultivated the earth like a garden, and introduced the utmost refinement into the minute affairs of life, remained but in a remnant of squalid barbarians who had lost even the memory of what their ancestors had done, and regarded the surviving fragments of their grandeur as the work of genii, or of the mighty race before the flood. So true is this that when we think of the past, it seems like the inexorable law, from which we can no more hope to be exempt than the young man, who feels his life in every limb, can hope to be exempt from the dissolution which is the common fate of all. Even this, O Rome, must one day be thy fate, wept Scipio over the ruins of Carthage, and Macaulay's picture of the New Zealander musing upon the broken arch of London Bridge appeals to the imagination of even those who see cities rising in the wilderness and help to lay the foundations of new empire. And so, when we erect a public building, we make a hollow in the largest cornerstone and carefully seal within it some mementos of our day, looking forward to the time when our works shall be ruins and ourselves forgot. Hmm. I think I'm probably going to end it there. I mean, when I think about all this, I think of a few different systems that could sort of possibly have existed. This idea of a singular civilization that continually progresses. In that way, we wouldn't be left with these skeletons of other civilizations. But short of that, how sort of like how else could progress take hold? And it's sort of weird to think about that. Um, it's hard to think of other ways other than what has happened with different civilizations arising, stagnating, falling, and then other civilizations sort of starting over. There could always be some aliens that show up. You don't really see many fusing of great civilizations very often. At least not in the. I mean, you could argue that whatever arises afterwards or something. Or you could argue that when one civilization sort of conquers another, it fuses a bit. I don't know. It seems strange to think that we could establish a civilization or get to some point. Like, are we just waiting for one civilization to progress so far that it breaks through some level of social technology that then it can be this utopian Star Trek everlasting human civilization that takes over the rest of the galaxy? Or are we just setting up for Star Wars with the Empire and the Rebellion? And is that always the fate? I mean, Progress and Poverty and George's claims, his claims do tend to be of the type where it's like it is solved. And if we were to have all these policies in place, there would be continuous progress. Of course, George would admit that were these policies ever removed, um, then everything would revert. And I guess that's sort of what he's saying. Sort of de facto is what happened in a lot of these civilizations where there was a lot of justice and fairness, and people received the fruits of their labor. And then it came to be dominated by certain smaller groups, and the justice, uh, there was no more justice, and so the civilization stagnated and fell. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye bye.